So first, during the webinar, you can interact with our presenter by using the tools to the right on your screen, such as the chat box, or you can react with emojis on the side. If you have any issues during the webinar with technology, try logging out of Zoom and logging back in, as sometimes this fixes any kind of glitchy issues. For those of you receiving continuing education for this presentation, there are a few things I want to let you know about that. So first, participants who are present for the full webinar are eligible for CEs. You will receive a short survey via email to complete this related to the webinar. After the CE coordinator receives your survey, you'll receive a certificate via email. This can usually take up to 1 to 2 weeks. So know that after this webinar, you can anticipate that you probably won't get that survey or the CE for a couple weeks after today. Finally, we also have additional really great webinars coming up, and we hope that you can join us for those as well. So you can stay up to date by looking at our new NCACES website, which I can drop that link in the chat box, or you can also follow our social media pages. And lastly, if you have any questions about any of these things, feel free to reach out to us at northcentralaces@gmail.com. Again, I'll put that information in the chat box as well. So finally, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Adams is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and an independently licensed professional counselor in the state of Nebraska. Her clinical background focuses on working with individuals with a history of trauma or in crisis. Her research focuses on significant learning experiences in counselor education, systemic and emotion-focused clinical interventions, stress response, and the application of attachment theory in clinical and academic settings. Both clinically and academically, Dr. Adams is focused on social justice, counseling, and empowering clients from a culturally humble perspective. So it is my great honor and privilege to let Dr. Adams have the stage.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for sharing space with me today. For those of you that are in Central Time Zone, we're a little bit earlier. And for those of you that are joining potentially from Pacific Time Zone, this is quite early for you. So I appreciate you all spending this morning with me. Throughout the presentation, I do not mind if you ask questions through the chat or if you unmute yourself and ask questions. Either of those is fine. I will also throughout the presentation stop and pause and ask if there's any questions. So just know that those spaces are coming also if you want to wait for a pause in the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, can you all see my PowerPoint slides right now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I will keep an eye on the chat, but Jessica is also going to be helping me keep an eye on the chat. And then we will also keep an eye if anybody raises their hand, and we can also function in that way too. So thank you all for being here for this presentation. I want to start by reiterating that there are a bunch of other really wonderful webinars that are coming up on community-based participatory research, suicide training and clinical mental health curriculum, and considering trauma and supervision. So please keep in mind these next couple that are coming up over the next month. There's some really great topics that I think really do kind of dovetail nicely off of what we're talking about today. And thank you so much, NCACES, for inviting me to be a part of this. So like was said in the introduction, my name is Dr. Adams. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an assistant professor in my 3rd year at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, and I'm also the coordinator of our clinical mental health counseling track. This year, I've had the privilege of being the NCACES treasurer, and so that will continue for the next year or so. And so I've been really excited to be able to contribute to NCACES in this way. And so if you have any questions about kind of the executive council part of NCACES or how to get involved, please let me know. I also want to plug that our conference in the fall is going to be in Omaha. So I do not have to travel far for that. So I hope all of you are also putting on your radar to join us at the conference in the fall. So today we have three primary learning objectives. The first one is to introduce the basics of Finks significant learning theory taxonomy. So I don't know how many of you all have had exposure to this theory. This was the one that was taught to me in my PhD program and has been a really great way for me to conceptualize how to build a course, how to frame the learning activities, how to frame the assessment measures. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. Then we're going to talk about cultural humility and multicultural orientation as a whole. And then we're going to really get into how these concepts can be used to help us inform the way that we are teaching. So I have tons of screenshots of my syllabi from my counseling theories class, from my multicultural class, from the crisis and trauma class. So in the end, you're going to get to see how this looks in my syllabus. You're going to get to see my course descriptions and how I talk to students about the application of these theories and integration. And so I hope that you not only walk away from this with a general understanding of these two theories, but also maybe with some concrete activities that you can take and integrate into your summer syllabi, your fall syllabi, or your syllabi for next quarter. So this is our flow for today, and let's just jump right into it. So Finks' model of significant learning experience in college courses has so many components in it. I found many aspects of this book to be influential in how I design my courses. This kind of holistic integrative theory involves how we craft learning goals, creating in-class and out-of-class assignments that complement each other, assessment measures and rubrics, and providing models for different types of teaching styles, like team-based learning, problem-based learning, accelerated learning. So just like we tell our students it's important to have a coherent counseling theory, not just a bunch of techniques that they throw at clients, Finks' integrative course design has helped me feel like I have a consistent and coherent way to build my courses. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to dive into all the aspects of this integrative model. Honestly, I could have probably just had a webinar focusing on this integrative model and designing courses using it. But we're going to focus on one specific type of this model, which is the learning taxonomy. And that's going to help us conceptualize what happens in the classroom and outside of the classroom to help us facilitate significant learning experiences. But I strongly recommend, if this is a piece after learning this little kind of component of it that's interesting to you, that you grab this book. It has lots of worksheets involved with it and lots of ways that you can use to kind of help build your courses. So I know many of us are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy as a way to guide how we create course assignments and assess them. This is a similar framework with a couple of key differences to it. So first of all, it's not hierarchical, and it involves two additional domains, the human dimension and the caring dimension. So in the next slide, we are going to dive into each of these dimensions a little bit more. But for me, those two factors make this taxonomy feel more useful than Bloom's taxonomy for counselor education students. We are in the business of not just teaching concepts, but also teaching ways of being and fostering a level of reflexivity that allows our students to hold space for others without their own stuff getting in the way. So that human dimension and the caring dimensions provide a pedagogical structure for that, on where those reflective activities, where those ways of learning about others and ourselves that are applicable to the content can really be engaged in the classroom. So this picture demonstrates the same taxonomy, but in two kind of different ways. But in either way we look at it, it's integrative and it's interconnective, which is the nature of Finks learning taxonomy. So for me, this makes a lot more sense for counseling students as we're thinking not about kind of pushing them up this hierarchy of learning, but rather how do we integrate a bunch of information, integrate a bunch of topics and skills and foundational knowledge and flexibility that they're going to need to also kind of model when they're sitting with a client and they're trying to integrate new information into what they've learned in the classroom. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these domains. So foundational knowledge refers to students' ability to understand and remember specific information and ideas. So this is going to include those major concepts, ideas, perspectives, and something that's a little bit different from Bloom's taxonomy is it also involves the context of them. So it's more than just memorizing this foundational knowledge, but it's memorizing and understanding the foundational knowledge within the context that it was created. We want students to understand this foundational knowledge not at a memorize, regurgitate level, but we want them to understand it at a depth that will allow them to explain and manipulate that content. So there's a depth that comes to this foundational knowledge that, that makes it so it's not just rote memorization. So think about teaching counseling theory and teaching it within the time frame that the counseling theory was created. So in my counseling theories class, what we do at the beginning of every new theory we talk about, we jump into what was happening around the time when this theory was created, when it became popular, who was in charge, what was the zeitgeist of the time, and talking about the natural limitations that are baked into counseling theories based on the zeitgeist of the time that they were created, right? Because there was just knowledge that we have now that they didn't have then. There were concepts, there was ways of thinking, there was ways of interacting with people that have changed over time. And so foundational knowledge is much more than just like those key concepts of our counseling theory. It's putting them in context. Next is going to be application, and this includes the ability to engage with an action associated with the concepts. So Fink talks about learning to engage in 3 different ways: practical, creative, and critical. So critical thinking is going to involve that kind of application that we typically think about, where we're analyzing information and we're critiquing information. The practical involves problem solving and decision making. And then the creative involves new ways, new ideas, and new perspectives. So Fink also includes in this domain teaching students how to manage complex projects and performative skills, which is going to be kind of our skills demonstrations that we typically use in kind of skills class, or maybe you use them in DSM class, maybe you use them in your theories class, your crisis class, right? Those applications of the skills demonstrations are also going to be in this section. So then let's move into integration. So this is going to allow students to connect concepts between different things. I think a lot of times when we think about integration, we think about integration of specific ideas or potentially of different courses or disciplines, but Fink also pushes us to think about integration as integrating different realms of the student's life too into the content. So how do we invite students to bring in multiple parts of their identity and think about how we're integrating content, integrating information into those multiple domains of life? How does this content change if I use it in a school setting, if I use it in a clinical mental health setting, if I use it in an incarceration setting, right? How do I integrate the information I know about these settings, the information I know about these people into my knowledge now? So it's fostering those connections into different ways that maybe we didn't actually teach the information in the class. All right, so then the 2 kind of newer ones that we're going to be talking about is this human dimension and the caring dimension. And we spend a lot of time in these spaces in our counselor ed classes, but we, until I kind of found Fink, I didn't really have a way of conceptualizing these 2 ways of learning. So where are we starting? The human dimension is when students learn about the social and personal implications of what they're learning. So this type of learning can give students a new understanding of themselves, a new understanding of the version of who they want to become, and more confidence in moving towards things that are important to them. It allows them to have a better understanding of others and provides perspective on why others may act the way that they do or may be different from the student. So this human dimension kind of really pushes this reflective component that's happening for student, and this reason why we need to engage with ourselves in a reflective way and engage with others in a reflective way. Caring is slightly different. And so caring is when students learn about something that's actually going to change the degree that they care about it. Right? So I can learn about something different from me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change the way that I care about it. Right? So I think that's the distinction between the human dimension and the caring dimension. So the caring dimension is often going to spark students to have changes in their feelings, in the things that they're interested in, or in their values. I often see this kind of come alive for students in my crisis and trauma class when we start to learn about different concepts, especially, I see this especially like with my school counselors, when we start to learn about some of the developmental implications of trauma. And you start to see for students like, oh, I didn't know if I necessarily wanted to work in a trauma specific setting, but I care about this so much. I care about how trauma impacts the way children learn, the way children engage in relationships. And it kind of sparks them to think about, okay, so what happens next here? Because now I have this motivation because I care about this, because I'm invested in this. And it kind of creates this different type of learning for them where they engage with the content in a different way. And then the last one is learning how to learn, which is when students are engaged in this type of learning that makes them want to learn about the process of learning, learn how to be a better student, or to inquire and construct knowledge in a different way that's independent from how you brought it into the classroom. So that learning how to learn piece is, okay, so we have them for 8 weeks, 15 weeks in our classroom, but there's no possible way I can teach you everything about counseling theories in that 15 weeks. How am I going to motivate you as an intentional pedagogical component of my class to continue to engage with this content after you leave my class? Right? This thought that I am planting the very smallest seed right here, because it takes years to master a counseling theory. So how are you going to intentionally build into your class a way for students to continue to engage with this content even after the semester's over? All right, so I'm going to stop there for a second before we shift into multicultural orientation. And just pause and see if there's any questions or comments before we shift a little bit to talk about the other model that we're going to integrate in this presentation. Okay. All right. Well, please feel free to let me know if there's something that you have a question about, or stop me along the way if you have a question. All right. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about multicultural orientation before we move into what my classes look like. So there are 2 citations for multicultural orientation that I put up here. The original citation was Owen 2013, and then a wonderful book came out called Cultural Humility, Engaging Diverse Identities in Therapy. And that's that second citation there, the 2017 citation. So even though this book is focused on specifically cultural humility, it also covers all of the different pillars of multicultural orientation. I absolutely love this book, potentially as a kind of optional text for a multicultural counseling course, an optional text for a skills course, an optional text for a theories course. I really do think that there's a lot of utility in this. There's lots of case studies, lots of examples. And so when I have used that in class with students, they have really loved the layout and the readability of that text. So if this is a theory that's new to you, or one that you're thinking about a textbook to integrate into the class, I think that Cultural Humility, Engaging Diverse Identities in Therapy text is a really great option. So how is orientation different from competency? So traditionally in our field, we've talked about the student acquisition of skills and knowledge to work with people that are different from them in the realm of competencies. Multicultural orientation is a slightly different way of thinking about that skill set. And is complementary to the competency model. So when I was first introduced to multicultural orientation, I thought that potentially it was like a totally separate piece, or not necessarily as complementary to multicultural competency. But really, the more that I've dug into it and the more that I've thought about the application of it, these really do complement each other. And so the way that I have conceptualized these is multicultural competencies are the what, and multicultural orientation is the how. So a little bit of a subtle shift there from concrete concepts to the way of being. Part of the reason I started seeking out potentially a different model to help students understand multicultural, working with people that are different from them, is that when I was introducing the competencies to students, they were like, sweet, totally understand this. And what does this actually look like in session, right? Like, how do I actually do all of these different pieces of multicultural competency that we see in the Ratz et al. Model? So this multicultural orientation, which we'll talk about a little bit more in this next slide, is the how for students on how they're going to apply these competencies in session. So there are 3 pillars to multicultural orientation: cultural humility, cultural opportunities, and cultural comfort. So cultural humility is the foundational concept that the other 2 rest on. Culturally humble therapists are able to have an accurate perception of their own cultural values, as well as maintain an other-oriented perspective that involves respect, a lack of superiority, and attunement regarding their own cultural beliefs and values. So there's these 2 aspects of cultural humility: the intrapersonal and the interpersonal aspects. So the intrapersonal aspects of cultural humility captures how therapists are able to view themselves culturally. So this is going to include us understanding our bias, our strengths, our limitations, our areas of growth, beliefs, values, attitudes, assumptions, right? Like all those goodies that we always try to prompt students to reflect on when they're thinking about different concepts, when they're thinking about what of their own stuff they're bringing into the classroom or into the counseling relationship. Culturally humble therapists should be open to feedback from others, and be able to incorporate that feedback in a non-defensive way. So I think that piece is really important when thinking about defensiveness and how we engage with things that are different from us and people that are different from us. I think sometimes our students, when they engage with things that are different from them, right, they get scared about not feeling competent. They get scared about being seen as ineffective. They get scared about the evaluative process where we are judging them not just on their skill acquisition, but on their natural dispositions. And so they overcompensate with like this confidence that may come off as defensiveness or may come off as arrogance, right? May come off as more rigid than we'd like them to be, especially with engaging with things that are different from them. So culturally humble therapists are going to be able to engage in a way that is flexible, right? That's kind of gentle. I've kind of taken the word gentle and co-opted it to use it in a lot of different contexts. But I think like this gentle engagement with people that are different from you, with yourself. The interpersonal aspect of cultural humility describes a way of being with others that's open and curious. Right? So we want to be curious about other people's beliefs, and we want to value rather than being presumptuous or authoritative about it. And I think that that's a slight difference from the way that we've traditionally taught multicultural courses, right? Where we teach these kind of pot of skills, pot of foundational knowledge about different types of people. And so I think sometimes our students take that information in and kind of generalize that to like all people of this ethnicity or this race respond in this way or have had these experiences. And so when I engage with them, I can come in confident, right, that I understand their experience because I learned about these pot of people. And so cultural humility is going to say, whoa. Great that you have that foundational knowledge. That's excellent. That's great foundation. And I want you to remain curious about how that foundational knowledge actually presents itself in your client, right? I want you to keep that in the back of your head, but still have some flexibility there, that the experience of the person sitting in front of you might be vastly different, might be slightly different. Maybe it's going to be spot on to what you read in your multicultural textbook, but we're going to lead with curiosity, not with assumptions. So the second piece is cultural opportunities. Or actually, let me go back to cultural humility. I think the piece that students really love about this cultural humility is that curiosity is an action step, right? If I tell them, I need you to pull back from doing this and I need you to be more curious, what would curiosity look like in your counseling session? What kind of questions would tell you that you're being curious and that you're being open? It gives students something to do in session to actually engage with cultural humility in that way. So a lot of times they will see in my notes to them after reviewing sessions that this was a space to be curious, right? Like at this moment, I would have stopped and paused and given some more space. And so that also helps me as an internship and a practicum instructor kind of have this action word that I can use to help students become more culturally humble. So then the next piece is cultural opportunities. And so cultural opportunities are markers that occur in therapy, which a client's cultural beliefs, values, or other aspects of their cultural identity could be explored. So cultural opportunities arise when a client mentions something about a belief or a value or their cultural heritage. And these moments are going to provide natural chances for therapists to transition into deeper exploration into a client's cultural identity. Missing these cultural opportunities can communicate to a client that we don't believe that their cultural identity is important in this space, or potentially be considered a microaggression. So when we're thinking about cultural opportunities, it does require us to have some sort of foundational knowledge around value systems, right? Around beliefs, around what may be the client talking about culture. I think about my experience with my own therapist and how I love it when she pushes me when I'm talking about something and I'm explaining something and she just pauses and she says, so talk to me about how all of this is nestled within the context of you being a Black woman in America, right? Like let's zoom out to this kind of micro that we've come in and let's talk about context. Let's talk about that, how that is impacting the way that you're thinking about this, the way that you're processing this, right? So she invites that part of me into the space to create more nuance to my experience. And so telling students that they don't just need to wait for kind of these big glaring signs that say like culture, ask them about culture, right? Like in any point in the therapeutic relationship, we can pause and we can challenge our clients to nestle their experience within culture to help them get more perspective. And that is what cultural opportunities are. So then the final aspect is cultural comfort, which is the feeling that comes before, during, and after a culturally relevant conversation happens in session. So emotional states such as feeling at ease or feeling open or calm or relaxed are hallmarks of cultural comfort. And I think those concrete kind of internal experiences are really helpful for students also. So when I am watching tape with students or asking students to reflect on a session, sometimes I'll ask them to, if we're watching tape, to pause and tell me like what was happening internally for you in that moment. Right? Was your heart racing? Were your thoughts racing? When you were thinking about broaching, did your palms get all sweaty? And did you start to kind of run through all of the different ways that this could go terribly wrong? Right? What was actually your internal experience before you broached, while the conversation was happening, and then after it was done? And for some students, that can be a really vulnerable question. Right? But we want them to be able to experience that. I want to know that if you have a conversation about culture with your client, if as soon as that conversation's done, all you feel is relief that it's done, we have some work to do there, right? Like what I want you to feel after it's done is like this calmness, this joy that you've learned the different aspects of your client's identity. Right? Not relief that like, oh, that hard conversation was done. I'm just so glad that I don't have to have that conversation again. And so encouraging students to kind of have this internal monologue where they're checking in with their experience about what it actually feels like to have these conversations. Therapists with high levels of cultural comfort can moderate their anxiety in session when they're having those cultural conversations, and instead engage with the client in a composed, in a relaxed, in a connected manner. From a counseling theory perspective, I practice from an EFT perspective. So thinking about cultural comfort really kind of jives with the way that I think that counselors should be in session in general, right? That we should be attuned, we should be connected, and our physiological experience in session is going to impact the way that our clients regulate in session, right? This whole concept of co-regulation. And so the emotional state of the therapist provides a lot of information to the client. And so counselors with lower cultural comfort are more likely to miss those cultural opportunities, sometimes intentionally because they're anxious, they don't want to have the conversation, they see that they could have the conversation and they just let it fly right by, or unintentionally because they're so wrapped up in their own personal anxious experience that they're totally missing these opportunities to engage with their client's cultural world. And so that should communicate to the counselor that there is need for additional exploration there and development in that area. And I think it really gives us a frame as educators to help our students understand that internal experience. Gives them a little bit more to go with than like, reflect for me on how you felt having that conversation. No, like, what was your anxiety level? Were you at ease? Were you comfortable? So this is the short and sweet review of both multicultural orientation and Finks significant learning taxonomy. Both have so much depth and meat to these that I really strongly encourage you to dig into both or either a little bit more if they're interesting to you. I have been reading and thinking about both these theories for years now and still continue to find new ways that this applies to myself as a counselor, myself as a counselor educator, as a supervisor. And so I found just a lot of utility in both of these theories that have given me a lot of depth in a lot of different areas of what I do as a counselor educator. Okay. All right. Let's talk about application. So I am going to be showing screenshots from my syllabi. If you would like to see the full syllabi of my counseling theories course, of my multicultural course, of the crisis course, please let me know. I am not protective of that content. I would like to support anybody that would like to potentially use that information to integrate into their own course. And so if any of the assignments that I've talked about are interesting to you, if you'd like to see the rubrics for the assignments on how I actually grade them, I'm more than happy to share. So there's, again, pieces of this that I just did not have time and or space to integrate into this presentation. And so if you'd like to have a more in-depth conversation about any of these courses or how I structure them, please reach out. I'm more than happy to have those conversations. Before we move into this, any questions, comments, concerns about cultural humility? Or multicultural orientation in general? Okay. All right. So the next two slides provide examples of general learning activities, assessment measures, and ways to integrate those pillars of multicultural orientation in each of those domains. So when we are holistically thinking about building a course, we want to ensure that we're hitting each of the domains and incorporating that into both our activities and our assessments. So I'm actually going to skip down here to show this before we talk about that. So the way that I'm thinking about, will the PowerPoint be available? Absolutely, I can make the PowerPoint available to participants. I'm more than happy to do that. So the way that we're going to be talking about how all of this nestles within it is thinking about what our learning goals are for the class, right? Making sure that we have like multicultural orientation baked into the learning goals. how those learning goals are going to connect to our learning activities and how that's going to connect to our assessments. And we're hoping that we're hitting all 6 domains in each of these, right? So let's go back and actually look at some examples. So these are general in-class activities and assessment measures for each of these different domains. There are many, many more, and I'm sure you can kind of start looking at your syllabus and sorting things, which I think could be really, really helpful. Because when you start looking at your syllabus and you see, wow, I have a lot of application, but maybe I'm not actually hitting foundational knowledge as much, because I think we kind of have ingrained in us that like straight lecture and quizzes is like a no-go, right? That we need to be more creative than that. We need to have all this integration and application, but we can't do significant learning. They can't engage in the integration and application if we don't spend a significant amount of time actually giving them the foundational knowledge and the context, right? And so I've played around with a couple different ways to do this. I've played around a little bit with recorded lectures. I've played around a little bit with kind of splitting class up so that we have lecture at the front half of class, maybe do an activity in the middle and then lecture at the back end of class. I've played around with students doing the lecturing, right? So I think there's lots of ways to break up the lecture, but I also don't think lecture is terrible. It's as long as we keep it fun and fresh and engaging and give lots of time to ask questions. Lecture is just this really key piece of the integrative learning model. So assessment measures for lecture, I've actually moved more towards a group quiz format than individual quiz format. So in my counseling theories class, we split our counseling theories into background focused theories, action focused theories, emotion focused theories, and cognitive focused theories. And so they have quizzes on each of those bunches of theories. And they have group quizzes. So I split the students into groups of 6, and it's a 30-question multiple choice quiz, and they have an hour to talk with their group about the answers to it. It's closed book, it's closed note, but they can use collective knowledge, because I know that some students are going to engage with some content a little bit easier than others, and I don't want to penalize them for not kind of understanding a concept as best they can. And the feedback I've gotten from students is that the learning experience that happens in the group quizzes is like almost just as helpful as what happens prior to it, because they're learning from their peers. They're learning how to negotiate answers. They're learning how to engage in the content in different ways. They're learning when to push and when to pull back. So I have become a huge proponent of group quizzes. I have really, really enjoyed it. And so I think the way that we can think about how multicultural orientation can be integrated into the foundational knowledge component is how are we putting concrete information and stats about people, places, and things that are different from our students into that. Also, I think understanding historical context is really helpful too. So what was happening at the time that the PTSD diagnosis was created? Right? What was happening at the time when Freud was in Vienna? I think whenever I lecture on Freud and I have students talk to me about the zeitgeist of Vienna when he was there, it's like, no wonder his theory was sex, sex, sex. You all know what was happening in Vienna around the time Freud was there? In context, this makes Freud look so much more sane, right? That this is all about the zeitgeist of the time. And so then for students, when we put all these concepts back into context, it just gives it a new breath of air for them. The next one is application. So in class, we do a lot of application in case studies. So having them break into groups and work with case studies together. In the crisis and trauma class, I have them do a case study where they have the DSM out, and it's a case study that's double spaced. And so they go line by line and they circle the parts of the case that would give them information that the client is meeting criteria for PTSD, right? So I'm having them kind of pull out, okay, what are the avoidant behaviors, right? Like what are the hyperactivation behaviors, right? What are the startle response behaviors? So that they can start to see that like maybe this client almost meets criteria for PTSD, but how do I actually pull out the relevant information to make that diagnostic decision? So I play around with case studies a lot in that way in the crisis class, doing a lot of role plays, doing some fishbowl activities. I don't use fishbowl as much. I have some colleagues that are very, very skilled in doing fishbowl activities. Makes me anxious, I'm gonna be honest with you, to do them. I haven't quite mastered it yet, and so I don't use it as much, but I do think that they could be a very wonderful way to do application. Analysis and then debate. The way that I use debate in class, I think I use it in my post-traumatic growth lecture. And so I have students, one group of students that talks about post-traumatic growth is real, and another group that says it's not real. And I have them independently look at the scholarship to kind of support their ideas. And then they have an in-class debate talking about post-traumatic growth. So in areas where the literature is really split, I think a great way to have students play around with the different ways that we're talking about a concept is to use debate in class. I think it's a great way for them to learn all of that content instead of us just didactically presenting it. So multicultural orientation can be kind of swooped up in this by having students do critical analysis of theories and models. And creative ways to adapt skills, and then practicing broaching, of course, is going to fall under application. Next, we have integration. So for integration, this is going to be multiple concepts that are not necessarily taught together. So maybe you're going to have them pull information from their human development class into the theories class, or pull information from the substance use class into the crisis class. I think the integration is hard because we sometimes don't know what our colleagues are teaching as best as we could. So I do think that there's some intentionality from us as instructors to really, truly be able to integrate information. Is we have to know what our colleagues are teaching. And so part of that is asking questions. Part of that is potentially looking at colleagues' syllabi. We have started in our department that we have a shared OneDrive folder where everybody's syllabi lives. And so every semester you throw your syllabus in there so that we can actually see what other people are teaching. So that gives us kind of this understanding. When we did that, we also realized that there was tons of redundancy in our content too, which kind of opened up some space for us to say, do these concepts need to be really redundant? Some of them are important and they do need to be taught in every single course. Or how do we shift them so that they're getting a slightly different angle of the same content in different courses? Cumulative projects are also a great way to integrate concepts across the lifespan of a course. There's a wonderful paper on an unfolding case model for teaching about crisis, where the students meet the client, right, during like the first class period, and that kind of simulates maybe that introduction session with the client. And then as you teach more concepts over the course of the semester, the case unfolds and the students get more information about that client case. That requires, right, again, a lot of intentionality on our part, a lot of structure on our part, but I do think that beautifully simulates for students how, as we sit with clients and learn more about their life, about their situation, we do change the way that we engage with them, with the diagnosis, with the treatment plan, because we have more context, more information to go off of. I think I've heard about doing that in like a paper-based form and doing it in a video form. So that might be something if you have grant funding to kind of collaborate with actors on campus or bring in actors, creating an unfolding case that you can use throughout your class for integration might be a really great way to use that grant funding if that's something that you have at your disposal. I believe Wake Forest at some point had a grant to bring in actors to help with the this is like, I'm like feeling quite old because I was like, man, my master's program was so close. Like now it's starting to get foggier and foggier the further it goes away. I'm remembering that we had actors that came in and helped us learn how to do assessments with individuals in domestic violence relationships. I believe there was another lesson that we also had actors come in and help us better understand the content. And so you might be able to reach out and get some support from folks there if you have questions about the grants. So then the caring dimension, this all happens in my classes, in those small group activities, in reflections that happen, in genograms. I think taking the genogram and using it in some creative ways can be a really helpful way of helping students understand more about themselves and caring more about the content. I also use a lot of this caring dimension and this human dimension kind of overlap quite a bit for me, because it's about kind of learning more about yourself, learning more about others, and then caring about the information a little bit more. So discussion boards are a really great way to engage with that caring piece, either written or video. I've moved more towards video discussion boards than written discussion boards, where students take a video of themselves for 2 to 3 minutes, talking about their discussion points, and then they respond to their peers in video. I feel like that simulates conversation just a little bit better than discussion boards, and it gets them away from those like discussion board response where it's like, dear so-and-so, I really love this point. It's different from my point in this way, right? We're like, it's kind of become a very robotic way that our students respond to discussion boards, unless we're very intentional about scaffolding that in a different way. I've also found that it's helpful for students if I assign a discussion board, give them a week to post their initial one, and then give them an additional week to post to their peers. So when I open discussion boards, I typically have them open for 2 to 3 weeks. And I tell students that in that first week, I want them to spend a ton of time crafting their own response, how they like really digging into that. I don't want them to be thinking about their peers' responses at that point. And then starting at week 2, I want them to peruse all of their peers' responses and find the ones that they can actually engage with in a meaningful way. I think when we try to squeeze discussion board posts into that 1 week, everybody kind of waits until that last day to do them. And then our students are kind of scurrying to engage with the material in a time crunched way. And so I found that I've gotten a lot more depth and reflection in the discussion posts when I've opened them up in that way. And exposure to things that elicit new feelings, exposure to different interests and values. I think exploration of bias really comes into this caring component too for our students. Next, the human dimension. I love to bring in podcasts and movies and guest speakers and engage service learning. When I teach about the feminist theory lesson, there is this adorable podcast about this little girl that loved bugs and brought her bugs to school, and students said, girls don't like bugs. And so her mom posted something on Twitter asking about girls that like bugs, and the etymology community came out of the woodwork and all of these women posted pictures about how bugs are cool and how they hope that she doesn't lose her interest for bugs. And it's this really cute NPR podcast about how this thing that this girl loved so much was almost squashed because of what was a boy thing and what was a girl thing. And by having just really responsive parenting, they continued to foster this love that this girl had. So I use that podcast, and it kind of puts a face to feminist theory, puts a face to what happens when we gender interests, and I think has really helped students engage with feminist theory in an interesting way. Community-based projects also help with human dimension, information about our own cultural identity, and an increased self-awareness. And then the last one, learning how to learn. So student-led presentations, group projects, service learning. I'll show you in the next couple slides a service learning-ish project that we do in the multicultural course that really fits into this learning how to learn. But I think group and individual projects focus on student-directed learning that get them engaged with people, places, and things that are different from them and are a positive experience in a way that students continue to engage in that even after they're done. So let's actually look at some syllabi. As I'm learning to care about something externally to me, or is it something caring or caring? Oh, and that's a great question. Do you understand the caring dimension as other oriented, as in I'm learning to care about something external to me, or is it also about the experience caring in the class experience and with one another? Oh, I love that. So I think it is both an other oriented experience. Like I now not only know about you, but I also am invested in you, right? Like I care about your experience. I care about what is happening for you as kind of this motivation to move. So I think that for me, the caring dimension is really kind of other oriented in that way. And human dimension tends to be a little bit more reflective in the way that I've conceptualized them. But again, kind of as you can see in my theories thing, my assignments that tend to hit on caring tend to hit on both caring and human dimension. Right. I want you to know more about yourselves and others, and I want you to take that one step further, and I want you to actually care about it. So it's a really great question, Anne. Thank you for asking that. So these are actual screenshots out of my syllabi. So when I talk to students on syllabus day, or I've played around with actually having a syllabus day, I've also played around with recording a video of myself talking about the syllabus so that students can't say, I don't remember what you said on the first day of class. I can say, well, there's a really great video of me talking about it in your Canvas. So I'd love it if you look at that first. So I break up my assignments into these different spaces so that students know what the learning goal is, right? They know that if the learning goal is foundational knowledge, or is integration, or is caring and human dimension, it gives them kind of this broad area to go off of. So in my counseling theories class, I have a group quiz and then I have an individual quiz. I actually never used to have a final exam individual quiz, and per feedback from students, they wanted a summative individual quiz at the end of the semester to help them prep a little bit more for comprehensive exams and NCE, since those are independent ways of assessing this knowledge. So this will actually be the first semester that I have a final exam independent quiz in theories. I used to only do the group quizzes for students. So both of those are going to be my assessment measures for foundational knowledge. My assessment measures for their ability to integrate, apply, and learn how to learn are an annotated bibliography and a case study. So for the annotated bibliography, I'm very, very structured in how I assign that to students. I also give them a lot of suggestions of journals where they can find practice-oriented articles. I think that that's kind of the biggest hurdle with this counseling theories class, is I don't necessarily want them to find articles that are all theory or all numbers. I want them to also use articles that show how their theory can be used with different case illustrations and more application-based. And then the discussion boards, participation, and then cultural adaptations is kind of my theory-based cultural kind of push here. And so I have students take 2 theories of their choice. And what I want them to do is talk about the natural assumptions of that theory, right, that are baked into when that theory was created, who created it, who was in mind when the theory created it, what the limitations are as they pertain to diverse populations with that theory, examples of how they could simplify some of the jargon in that theory to work with a diversity of people, and then examples how they could diversify their interventions for that theory. So I'm trying to get students away from thinking they're like eclectic, which is really just them throwing a bunch of different theories at a client, because they don't know what being eclectic is yet. They're not developmentally in that place. And so I'm trying to get them to a place where they can stay in their theory and adapt it, right, for people that are different from them, instead of thinking, oh, who's the person sitting in front of me and how can I remember out of the 15 theories I learned, which one's going to be best for this client, because that's just not realistic. That's not how we function. That's not good counseling. And so that cultural adaptations piece of my theories class has been really helpful in helping students understand they can stay in a single theory and they can shift it and make it more flexible to help diverse populations. I also set up kind of the broader piece that happens when we're talking about the points in this way too. So I'm very transparent about my pedagogy in all of my syllabi. I'm very transparent about my pedagogy when I'm talking to students about different pieces. I want to make sure I save a couple minutes. I know we have about 5 minutes left right now. And so this is my multicultural counseling course, right? So same consistency. I think I am trained in trauma and crisis. So consistency, transparency, all of those different pieces. All of my Canvas are in the same exact structure. All of my syllabus are in the same exact structure. I try to carry that through for my students. So for foundational knowledge and human dimension, we have participation. For the multicultural class, we have some quizzes, we have culturally appropriate clinical reactions, and we have reflections. And then in my multicultural class, I have 2 big assignments. One is an advocacy project, and the other is a counselor self-awareness project. So the advocacy project is other-oriented. The counselor self-awareness project is internally oriented. So for the project where they're out advocating, that has replaced what we traditionally see in the multicultural counseling course as them going out and being around somebody different from them. This is asking them to approach a community organization that supports a marginalized community and say, I have 8 weeks of time and 5 people, how can I be of service? Right? I don't want students to come in and tell an organization how they're gonna change, what they're gonna do, how they're gonna implement. I want them to channel their energy with humility. I want them to approach an organization and tell them they have resources, tell them they want to be of service, and ask what needs to be done. This project has really created some really, really wonderful just ways of engaging with the community, from creating a website that has all of the phone numbers and pictures and locations of all of the Black therapists in the Omaha community. I had students that created an Instagram for a nonprofit that knew nothing about Instagram, but they created it. They taught them how to use the analytics on the back end. They got a following generated, and then they handed it off to the organization at the end of the semester. So there's been some really, really cool projects that have come out of that advocacy one, and it's helped students understand that advocacy is about humility, right? Advocacy is about servant leadership. Advocacy is not us coming in with our big brains and telling all these organizations how we're going to help them. So I've really loved that part. I think that's been really helpful for students. And I want to quickly show the last one, the crisis and trauma one, because again, you will see, right, like some of the same assignments that are coming up with different bents. So they have a take-home exam, they have the psychological first aid model. We do 2 demonstrations. We do a demonstration of QPR and safety planning, and then a demonstration of using the Columbia Suicide Severity Scale, a case study where they have to choose either Finding Nemo, Killmonger from Black Panther, Harry Potter at Any Age, June from Handmaid's Tale, or Tony Stark. And they have to use a theory of trauma or a theory of crisis to conceptualize that character. That assignment also has a ton of scaffolding. There's an implicit bias reactions assignment in this class, where they're reflecting on skin tone, weapons, and disabilities. And then there's a participation. So I know that I didn't get to spend as much time on those last couple pieces, and so I apologize for potentially spending a little too much time on the front end of that and not as much on the back end. But you all will have access to all of these slides, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, concerns. As you can see, I love talking about this stuff. I think that this is very fun. And so I would just love to have a community of counselor educators that are talking about this. So thank you all for all of the thank yous in the chat. It has been lovely to spend this lunch hour with you. And please let me know if I can support in any way.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Adams, for sharing your expertise and invigorating our Wednesday with some information. Just a reminder to everybody, if you are interested in continuing education, you will receive a survey in about 1 to 2 weeks from NCACES. Once you complete that survey, you'll then receive a CE certificate. When you receive that email, we'll also include a copy of the PowerPoint from this presentation. And if you do have any questions, please contact NCACES and also check out our upcoming webinars. Thank you all.